everyone. Welcome to my channel. My name is Lisa Allistway, and on this channel, you will find a variety of inspirational and informational videos. So if that sounds good to you and you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. My guest today is Naama Kates, who is a writer, producer, and creator of the Incel Podcast. I will be linking her podcast and her Twitter handle down below in the description box for your reference. Welcome, Naama.
Good to be here.
Yes. Okay, so for the audience that don't even know what an incel is, can you please describe and define what an incel is?
Sure. So the word incel is what's called a portmanteau. It's a word made up of parts of other words, and they are, in this case, involuntary celibate. So, it kind of speaks for itself. An incel is someone who defines themselves by the fact that they cannot have romantic relationships or sexual relationships, despite wanting them. Mm-hmm. They are generally, almost completely male. There's some question about whether women can be incels. A lot of them don't really think so. Those call themselves femcells. It's a bit different. And they're usually quite young. The majority of them, I'd say, are very young. They are, they've kind of formed a community for themselves online. It's only online. They don't really meet up in person or anything like that. And they, it's over the last 5 years, it's really been going on for 10 years. The actual word came about in the 90s, but it didn't really become what it is as we know it now until 10 years ago, and really 5 years ago when it entered kind of the zeitgeist, or a bit more than that. It's also been associated with violence and domestic terrorism, rightly or not, because there have been a handful of attackers that, either claimed themselves to be incel or were participating on incel forums, or just talked in ways that, people later on in the analysis thought was, inspired by incel ideas. So, that's part of the reason that it gets a lot of attention.
Okay, very good. And so how prevalent is this incel community?
We don't have great numbers on that, but I would say that around the world, there's probably hundreds of thousands. I guess maybe even more people that, this is something that isn't necessarily, there are different levels of kind of engagement or commitment with it. If you just go by the categorical definition, which is someone who is involuntarily celibate, that number's probably huge. But these people, just think anyone in high school at some point might be one, right? Mm-hmm. But people that know of the term and define themselves that way, I would guess it's hundreds of thousands, mostly in the United States, Canada, Western Europe. And I guess that number, by the sizes of the communities that have been banned, there were some Reddit communities that showed to have 50,000 or so, and those numbers were probably actually higher because they were quarantined. And then the incel forums today, have had 50,000 registrants at some point. So, it's probably a pretty high number, like that.
So if there was no internet, there'd be no incel community. Is that correct?
Yeah, there'd be no community.
Okay, so they're defined by getting online, and that's where they're meeting and they're talking. What draws them to these communities?
Well, I ask all the ones that I interview, how they first found out about the term. And a lot of them just by going online, by going to places like Reddit or Quora or Discord servers, the gaming platforms, they might hear the term. Some of them hear it first in the news, through some media piece about an attacker. I think some people just go into Google and ask questions like, why can't I get laid? Or, am I unattractive? And this stuff comes up and they relate to it.
Okay. And you've mentioned that it really took off in the last 10 years. Does that coincide with social media?
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
What is the relevance of social media? How does it play into the incel community?
I would say that I think social media is almost like entirely responsible for it. in many ways, social media creates this illusion that many people feel when they look at themselves and compare themselves to others. Without social media, we wouldn't have this constant sort of curated version of everyone else's lives to look at, where it seems like everyone's having fun and going to parties and presenting themselves however they do. Um, so there's a lot of that. I think we're also in a sexualized culture, and that tends to spread more quickly with social media. Again, the comparisons, and so the feeling of being left out and of being other and of being maybe a loser or something for young men. For young women, it has ramifications too that are just as serious, but they manifest a bit differently. Um, but for young men, it's the feeling of not sort of sexually living up to what they think that they should be. And I think that's behind a lot of it. And then with social media now too, there's also kind of shocking culture, like things that came from 4chan and then Reddit, where being what they would call an edgelord or a shit poster is a way for someone who's maybe frustrated or feeling like an outsider to express themselves. The memes, the sort of extremist language, all of that makes
Mhm.
this situation what it
So
is.
you mentioned 4chan. What exactly is that for people who've never heard of that?
So 4chan was started in 2005 by a 16-year-old kid. His name was Christopher or something. I don't remember at the moment. And it was an image board. So it was based on these Japanese image boards where people would share anime and content like that, these kind of cartoons. What was unique about 4chan was that it was a social media sort of platform that you didn't have to register, and nobody had an account name. So people would just post comments and content completely anonymously. You wouldn't see a username, you would just see these comments and they would go quickly. And because of the nature of that, people's behavior changed a lot when they used 4chan, and it got really edgy, and it developed its own culture and its own humor that was very kind of counter-cultural and subversive. And it really took off. It's been connected to a lot of kind of crazy movements and things. And incel culture very much came about with 4chan.
Is it still in operation or did it get deplatformed?
4chan still is the original 4chan. I think it's a little bit different. It's a little bit more monitored now than it used to be. It became 8chan afterward, and 8chan had a lot of scandals. The hosts of 8chan got into some hot water for hosting it because there were just all kinds of, unsavory content on there, everything you can think of. There was another iteration called 8kun, and that most notably had the live stream of the Christchurch shooter from New Zealand. And so that one got deplatformed, and 8chan too, but 4chan is actually still up.
Okay. And are there underground forums that the incels can go on? I guess when I say underground, like in a special place on the internet that's really hard to get into?
You mean like on the dark web?
Yes.
Not really. I mean, I'm sure there are, but people often think that incels talk on the dark web. In actuality, their main forums and their main websites are on the clear web. And I think that's deliberate. For some reason, they want it to be accessible. I mean, I actually happen to know the administrators of the really popular, the main incel forum, and they're just people, but that's another story. But yeah, I think for some reason they kind of want things to be open. And there are different apps now. You don't necessarily have to go on the dark web for things to be more protected, because there are apps like messaging apps like Telegram and Signal and Discord that are encrypted. So there is a bit of that. But mostly it's not. Mostly it's on the clear web.
Okay. And so can you just touch on maybe like the profile of incels? I know they're on a spectrum. You can't group them all into one they're all like this, they're all violent, because
Right.
that's not true. Can you tell us a little bit, maybe like personality traits or characteristics that make up incels?
Yeah. So, um, you're right that they're not a monolith. One thing that kind of interested me a lot about their website, their community, was that they did polls of the community, like really in-depth polls that would have between 500 and 1,000 respondents. I mean, things that an academic study would dream of, having that kind of sample size. And so they did a really great demographic breakdown. And all kinds of things, where people live and their ethnicities and their age and their education level. And it was all over the map, but, largely, like I said, younger ethnicity. Actually, a lot of people assume that it was, all young white men, and it wasn't. It was 50-50, given the fact that most of them are in North America or Europe. That's not, that's actually less represented than, you might expect population wise. And different levels of education, sort of different economic backgrounds, not really anything too consistent there. As far as personality traits, um, you know, I actually was involved in some research along with a forum that looked into mental health issues, and upwards of 75% had depression, upwards of 80% had anxiety. Something like 20% were diagnosed on the autism spectrum, which is staggering compared to the general population, which is like 1%. And then another 25% or so thought that they might be, but didn't have a diagnosis. So that's very high, and that's significant. So a lot of them have, issues with just socializing in general. A lot of them report bullying. A lot of them don't have many friends in real life, feel kind of very disaffected. And there a lot of the interests are things like gaming and anime, and a lot of them are interested in history, kind of the in that sense. There are many that fit into kind of a typical profile of what we would have called a nerd at one point.
Yes. And so they go to these forums because maybe they feel isolated in their own life. Like you said, they don't have a lot of friends. So they might feel like they get some type of friendship out of these forums.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of them say that, the forum's like a home for them. They spend a lot of time on it. That they have found friends and that they relate to people. And also, and this is kind of a double-edged sword, they can talk about experiences that are very shameful, and embarrassing, that maybe they can't really talk about in real life with anyone, sort of frustrations and rejections and all of these things, feeling low about themselves. So I think on one hand, that's helpful for a lot of them because they can talk about it without feeling judged. On the other hand, they tend to dwell on those things. So it can keep some people stuck. So it kind of goes both ways.
Okay. And so what type of conversations are they having in these forums?
There will be, they have tags, right, for what they post.
They have like their own little language, I guess.
Yes, very much so. The language is, I think, the unifying factor. And there are things that they'll call life fuel, right? So those are encouraging things. Sometimes that might be somebody's achievement in school or work, or something like that. They have rope fuel, which is depressing. Roping is their innuendo for suicide.
So a lot of them also have suicidal ideation in
Yes,
this group.
yes. A lot of them do. I get messages from people that I keep up with and talk to sometimes, lots of times actually, about how suicidal they are. I'll get a photograph of somebody's armband from a psychiatric hospital. It's very prevalent in that group, and have had a lot of suicide scares, and some that actually happened.
So let me stop you there. So when they're hashtagging rope fuel, or like, do they get support from the other people, or discouragement, encouragement? Like what happens? How's the conversations going if somebody's like,
Well, the thing is that there's kind of a disaffected, like post-ironic culture that they have where a lot of the times there's an
Nothing
element.
matters.
Yeah, though they're very fatalistic. Yeah, that's their ideology. The black pill is quite fatalistic and depressing.
Mhm.
But a lot of the time too, there's a bit of humor, of kind of dark humor in it. So, a lot of times they're just doing it to vent, and people will make comments like, "Oh, brutal, bro," or whatever, and they'll kind of joke about it. And so that it's light. There's a lightness to it, which is how some people deal with dark things.
Right, right.
And it can be hard to tell sometimes how serious it is, but I think it's important to note too that they also communicate off of the forums, in messaging apps and things like Discord, and there they have the more kind of substantive conversations, I think,
Because
when
it's
it's
more
not
one-on-one, more intimate.
exactly. Yes.
What conversations are they having around women? Because my understanding, if you read like newspaper articles and so forth, they're very misogynistic, and their whole complaint is against women.
Yeah, so if you read the forums, it is extremely misogynistic. But what I've come to learn, and some people might think of this as making excuses or something, and it's not that I'm saying that there's nothing wrong with the way they talk on the forums, but just in my experience, not only with their conversations with me, but also with the way they talk about actual women that they know, that are in their lives, that they might talk to, um, they don't really feel very strongly about any of this misogynistic stuff. It becomes, I think a lot of it, they think it's funny. It becomes, um, one of their memes, their languages, just a way to be sort of absurdist and to complain about things. But they don't really extend those feelings to individuals. And when they meet some girl, which often they do at some point, now that I've been doing this for over 3 years, I'd say most of them graduate from this. Some of them stay in the incel community, but they actually, in real life, might have a girlfriend, might even be living with one,
Mhm.
don't harbor misogynistic feelings at all, but it's become a shtick at this point. So, there are definitely some of them, especially the younger ones, where I feel like the way that they talk, and those memes that they share affect them, especially ones on the spectrum. Sometimes, they can get into kind of a rabbit hole where they take it very seriously and they hyper focus, they fixate all of their energy on this feeling that society is unfair and that women will never like me and that it's so unfair, it's so much easier to be a woman. But it doesn't really translate so much into real life for most of them.
So is it more like a complaining community, a venting community? The majority do not act out on violence. It's more of just uh, maybe feeling unfair with life, maybe has handed
Yes.
them kind of a place to
Yes.
go because they can't say it in their real world environment, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, that is what it is. It's venting, it's complaining, it's killing time, it's getting a little bit of uh LARPing. They have this term LARPing, live action role playing, as maybe someone edgy and externalizing some of their feelings onto, political ideas, but they don't really take it seriously. As far as violence goes, I mean, I participated in a study recently that just showed this was something I kind of felt intuitively early on, that these are not violent people. If you look at the incel community in comparison to just any other group, really community of shared interests, I would think that the base rate of people that act out on anything is lower because they're so shy and so inhibited and have such limited life experiences that they really don't act out much. And there were some questions taken about comparing their speech, kind of some of the more violent rhetoric, to actual behaviors or any kind of criminality or violence, and it's not correlated at all. um, and then the attackers too, it's another issue, but if you really break down a lot of those cases, the incel community or the ideology has very little to do with the crimes, the attacks that were committed.
Very, very small percentage actually are these mass shooters and so forth that we read about and hear about.
Yes, I mean 99.99999% are
Yeah.
not. And I would even add that the shooters that are called incel attackers, when you begin to unpack those stories, for instance, Alec Manassian, really notorious one that had his trial just ended. He was sentenced last March in Canada. This is the Toronto
Oh,
van
he was
attacker.
like a sixth grader or something, that one?
No, he
No.
was
Oh.
he was in his mid-20s. He was in Toronto. He rented a van and just drove down people.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes, I remember that.
Yeah, that was one of the biggest cases. But when his interrogation footage was released unsealed, and I looked at it, I saw that his story about being an incel and his plan making couldn't be true. So he either lied about that or maybe he really believed himself, but it wasn't true. Then in the trial, it came out that he'd been fixated with mass shooters from a very young age, not incels, just the Columbine shooters and others. So the whole incel thing kind of seemed like a very last minute,
Mhm.
he was adding that on to kind of glom onto something to maybe give it more meaning. And the
Mhm.
judge in that case, when she gave her ruling, she said that, I'm not even going to consider this whole incel thing because I think that this young man just wants to be more notorious. And so I'm not even going to, so
Mhm.
there, Jake Davis recently, Plymouth shooting in the United Kingdom. Everyone was calling him an incel killer. And, I looked at his case quite a bit. He
Mhm.
didn't actually call himself an incel. He was familiar with their content, but he was also involved with anti-incel sites. The case was a domestic incident. The police ended up ruling it that way and said that,
Mhm.
that incel thing had nothing to do, was not a
Mhm.
motivating factor. So most of them kind of end
Mhm.
up like that.
So these forums, are they kind of cult-like? Like they try to get you addicted to coming and staying? It's not like that. So why do you have these anti-incel? Is that to get them away from those forums?
Well, I think that the anti-incel sites, I mean, I think that there are a few of them that have good intentions and that really just kind of want to help people. There are a few of those, but the main sort of anti-incel subreddit is just very antagonistic and cruel, really. They'll just take screenshots of their postings and make fun of it. And they just have the wrong idea about what this community is, but a lot of people do because it's covered that way.
Mhm. So what would be some common myths around incels that people might be misunderstanding about them?
I would say, the violence is the biggest one. Um, the profile is often, young, disaffected white guy living in his mother's basement. That's not true. Most of them are in school, some combination of school or work. If they're not, it's often because they have disabilities or, things like everyone else might. Um, People think that they're aggressive and that they go out of their way to sort of antagonize women. And I don't see that at all. Their forum has content that I would say is, extremely unpleasant, sometimes reprehensible, but it stays within the forum and it's not really intended for other people to read. I don't see them going out of their way to, get into conflicts with women or with people online. Sometimes there will be little Twitter spats and things, instigated by who knows, but it's not really something that they go out of their way to do. I think that there's also sometimes a conflation between incels and other groups in the manosphere, which is what we call now this sort of ecosystem of misogynistic, male supremacist type of groups. There's one called MGTOW, that's men going their own way.
Mhm.
These are usually older men. Many of them are divorced, have had, custody issues and things. Um, they are misogynistic in a way that I find less defensible, given that they have been married, have children, have had relationships with women. And so the things that they say, it's a bit of a different language than what incels do. There's pickup artists, PUAs, that give kind of misogynistic negging dating advice. um,
And they also pry on the incels, right? Try to get money from them. Let me teach you how to talk to girls. And, they really are predatory when it comes
yes,
to the incels.
yeah, I mean, they really exploit them, and their industry, actually, incels, one of the first incel websites, the one that the Santa Barbara attacker was on, this was before incels was really called incels, was called PUA Hate. So it was actually kind of a reaction to the whole pickup artist guru thing, that incels were unhappy with it,
The
because they were getting
Chads.
yes, right, and just people that were just exploiting them,
Yes.
giving them this advice that didn't end up working.
Yes. And for the audience that don't know, that this is part of their language, they call like really good looking men, I guess, that are in like a 9 or 10, and
yes.
they're
Yeah,
called the Chads, and then the Stacys are the really good looking women that they can never possibly date. And so
yes. There's also kind of a misconception that they call some women Stacys and some Beckys.
what's a
Beckys are,
Becky?
so some people think that a Becky's like an insult. It's actually not. Beckys are also attractive, and they're just kind of a different type. They're more, they say that like the Beckys are more intellectual, or maybe more like alternative or something, in their presentation. But they would covet either a Stacy or a Becky.
Yes, yes. So you mentioned earlier that, many will graduate out of these forums, hopefully with maturity, age,
Yeah.
wisdom, and so forth. Um, how many are still, like, you think, staying in it into their 30s and upwards?
It's a small percentage of the group, a very small percentage of the group, but there are quite a few. I've had a lot of them on my show. I actually like to talk to them because they become more moderate when they get older, and there's less sort of piss and vinegar, immature kind of just, static energy, and they don't try to black pill as much. A lot of them do develop some perspective on life, and yeah, those are interesting cases because they're usually not, they don't fit any kind of profile at all.
Is there any one interview that you've done that really stands out, or a story or an example that you can share with us?
Oh, there are so many. I mean, if it's like a recommendation of what to listen to, I could give some, but um, just stories. I guess the stories that are sort of the easiest to tell might be about the ones that have ascended, which is their term for getting out of inceldom. And there's one young man that had been on the show like 3 times, maybe even 4 times altogether, and was really extremely suicidal on one of the more recent episodes. And he was in his very early 20s. And his episodes always got a lot of comments, and a lot of times from women that like thought they could connect to him, that wanted to talk to him, that wanted to reach out to him because there was something very compelling about him. He was very frustrated. He was beginning to get worse, the more that I talked to him, and kind of like deeper into some of the black pill beliefs about the inequalities in society, and how he was convinced that things were never going to change. And after his most recent episode, he started talking to a listener, young woman that was kind of interested in psychology and certain topics. And through talking with her, and they began to become interested in each other, and also just conversations with me and with other people, he kind of realized that a lot of his issues came from his issues with his father, and the way that he saw his parents. He sided very much with his father. they'd gone through a very bitter divorce when he was like 10 years old, and his father kind of gave him some, I don't know, maybe his perspective was a bit off, I would say. And so he was kind of drinking that Kool-Aid a bit. I mean, and over the course of maybe 6 months or something, he just came to the realization that, his dad had always been very selfish and neglectful and misogynistic, really. And, he
Wow,
started,
he had a real awakening, a real
yeah,
honest look at his past, because a lot of times people don't want to like blame the parents or whatever. And
yes,
sometimes it is the parents that are
yes,
projecting their traumas onto their children.
often, almost always, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about some possible solutions for the incel community. Because we don't want people, because there's suicide here at play. There's a whole community that feels ostracized, forgotten, that are maybe socially awkward and so forth. So what could be some possible solutions to help the incel community?
I think a lot of people are trying to figure that out, and it is a big question. I think specifically to the incel community, I think a start would be being a bit more honest about, you know, uh, human nature in some ways. The fact that incels talk a lot about lookism and that people judge based on
Yes.
appearance.
Yes. And I was going to ask you about that, because lookism is another form of discrimination based on looks, is what they're
Mhm.
talking about. But women have lookism as well. So it's
Sure.
not just specific to an incel.
No, not at all. But I think that,
They forget that.
yeah, well, sometimes they do. I think one of the problems is that I think women have had lookism more so. If we look at throughout history, women were always judged on their appearance a lot more. People always talk about what a woman looks like. There's always been tremendous pressure for women to look a certain way, and it can be devastating. But I think we've gotten some awareness of that over the last, I don't know, 30 years, something like that. I'm completely just a guess, maybe 40 years, that there's been talk about body positivity and not having to meet ridiculously high standards. There's been a bit of an awakening and a movement with that for women, where there's at least some sensitivity to the fact that women are going through this, that many women are going through this, and that many young women are very deeply affected by it. And I think there isn't really much of that for men, for young men. I don't think people are aware of lookism for men as much.
That's interesting, because they haven't been as judged by their looks as much.
Yes,
Yeah.
and I do legitimately, a lot of incels would disagree with this, but I think that men are absolutely more visually oriented than women are when it comes to partner selection.
Mhm.
I do think that that's just the way most men are compared to women, but that doesn't mean that women aren't at all. And then again, now with social media and with dating apps, where the only thing you have to go on is the little
Mhm.
photograph.
Yeah, here's my height, here's my, what I look like. Are they thinking they're,
Right.
80% of them are getting swiped on no.
Yes, right. And it's, a millisecond swipe. And a lot of people have this illusion of, especially women, because, men are less picky, I guess,
Yeah.
this illusion of infinite swipes. So how do I even begin to narrow this down? Well, the guy who's under 6 feet or whatever, I'm just not going to pick. There's a lot of talk about that. But that is real, and it doesn't happen on dating apps. So I think being honest about that and being a little sensitive about that for young men, and not just dismissing it because it's a
Mhm.
real thing. Um, it, just being, if somebody is an incel or thinks a certain way, listening to them is very important, even if you disagree with what they're saying. Just listening patiently and trying not to jump on it and judge. And then I think just things that would probably benefit most people would benefit incels too. Um, Awareness of certain mental health conditions, more patience or sensitivity to people who maybe don't fit in as much. There's a lot of conformity. I think getting away from so much of the screens and the social media, and having in-person interactions and engagements with people is really important. We do
Mhm.
less of it now, and I think it's just so unhealthy for everyone.
It's distorting people's realities. I mean,
Yeah.
if you are looking at altered photos of women on Instagram
Yes.
that have been plastic surgery photoshopped up, you don't
Yeah.
know what a real woman looks like
Right.
anymore. And
Right.
so I think the more you can maybe get away from those addictive screens and
Hmm.
being a screen junkie, even with video games, it's going to help you a lot.
Yes. Yes. So that would certainly help. And then with media, more responsible media
Journalism.
coverage
Mhm.
of this topic. Yeah,
Yeah.
they always sensationalize it, and I don't know
And they box
how.
them in. They put them all in the same category,
Right.
and they're not all the same.
No, and they're just completely stigmatizing them. And then, most of the attackers, whether they're incels or not, are copycats of something, of someone. And that's because of how sensationalized the coverage of those attacks is. I mean, with the Plymouth shooting, there was just headline after headline after headline saying this guy was motivated by incel ideology, the evil incel cult, and all this stuff. And I wrote one piece in response to it, for Unheard, that just looked at his actual Reddit history and his YouTubes and said, this doesn't really look like that's the case. A month later, the director of counterterrorism policing there released a statement that said this was absolutely not motivated by that. This was a domestic incident. That got barely any coverage. And so there wasn't really a correction of that,
Mm,
that attitude. And that's how it is.
that's a
And
shame.
yeah, it really is. And it also, for people that do whatever is going on with them, that they are, you know, characterologically inclined to maybe at some point do something like this, those really sensational headlines,
Hmm.
those are, you know,
Yeah, we have a lot of irresponsible journalism in this country, for
yes.
sure.
Hmm.
So what about the men's rights movement? Do they play a role in helping these men? And, you know, is there any connection there that could be made?
There should be, there should be more of one. Um, I mean, the men's rights movement, I'm not as familiar with where that's been going. I did talk to them and went on some of their shows, and they have some points that I think are fair. Um, for some reason, I feel like there's a bit of they want to distance themselves from incels a bit. Um,
Because they believe a sensationalized grouping of them all, and they
yeah,
maybe
and
don't
they don't
want
want to
to
be associated with these
associated.
terrorists. Yeah.
Interesting, interesting. So what about a possible solution of, now this has to be interventions in high school, in junior high, like
Yes.
before they're even mature and dating and thinking about the other gender. I would think um, those relationships and interactions should happen at a younger age, so they're not socially awkward when they're 20
Yes.
years old.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
You know, it could be a missing component in the educational curriculum.
Yes, it is. And I don't know what exactly explains that, why it's become such an issue. We supposedly have a heightened awareness and sensitivity to all kinds of things. And, neurodivergent people. But kids are kids. And I think, kids are often cruel to kids that are a bit different. It's kind of hard to completely stop that. I think a lot of this too comes from just maybe unhealthy sort of family systems and modeling. There's a lot of that.
Oh yeah.
And
There's generational trauma. This has been
yes,
going on for decades, passed down with,
yes.
multiple broken homes,
Hmm.
multiple wives, multiple baby mamas, I mean, it's a
Hmm.
mess. We have a
Yeah.
mess going on.
Yes, we do. And just sort of, even if it's not something you can point to like that, there's this dysfunction that, I can just kind of feel when I talk to these people, that there's like codependency things and, narcissism things and neglect and all these things going on that I don't know how one could even begin to approach that, but it needs to be.
So one of the things that I noticed with these people going to these forums is they get that friendship and they get that pseudo therapy in those
Yeah.
forums. So why aren't they, so are they just kind of anti-therapy and not wanting to go maybe the professional route?
More of them have tried than I would have thought. It's more than 50%, not much more.
Did they
But I
just have
think,
bad therapists, a bad experience?
yeah, they didn't, most of them, overwhelming majority of them said it wasn't helpful. I'm guessing that a lot of them maybe just had gone to psychiatrists, didn't really have the therapy, more just got put on the meds and maybe
Got the
had a session
pills,
here or
yeah.
there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be a more of a holistic approach anyway. I mean,
Yeah.
if it could be even at like the spiritual domain, maybe they need to work on
Hmm.
that area to kind of
Yes.
get in touch with, maybe they're disconnected or detached from their who they are. And so
Yes, they are.
um
Yeah.
very much. What other thing would deplatforming these Reddit threads and so forth, would that be helpful?
No.
No, we don't want to censor. What's wrong with like trying to deplatform and censor these communities?
You can't make an idea go away by deplatforming it. Every time they do that, and they do it, they keep
Mhm.
doing it. It's kind of a cosmetic fix for the platform itself. They don't have to deal with this. With Reddit, it's gotten really bad,
Mm.
and they end up migrating somewhere. And
They go underground or they go somewhere else. And
yes,
so
maybe they lower the like overall total number of people that see it, but those are not the people that are going to be committed to it.
Mhm,
Those people are going to find it, and
mhm.
the space that they enter will be less monitored. If people are actually worried about crime, be harder to monitor. It will be
Harder to
more
research because
harder
I
to
mean,
research. Yep. It will be inaccessible. It will be more extreme, and it will be more of an echo chamber, where there's no diversity of thought. So
mhm.
everyone there is going to think the same way. I don't see that being healthy or
Would it
helpful.
be helpful to have like people coming into these forums and providing education to the
I think
incels,
so.
talking to them and maybe like planting seeds where they need to, and
I
you
think
know,
so. Yeah, I think so. I think it just needs to be done in a really smart way because, they're skeptical of things like that, rightly. A lot of times, some of the efforts to do that have been pretty clunky, even
yeah.
embarrassing.
Haven't you
I've
been,
seen some,
you've been accused as an FBI informant, which you're not.
yeah,
They're
right. I mean,
suspicious of you.
oh yeah, they're suspicious of everyone. And I have been accused of that and being a glowy. I mean,
What's a glowy?
a glowy is their term for like an informant or a fed,
Okay.
an undercover. Um,
Mhm.
I openly speak to law enforcement on my show, so I don't hide that. And nobody that I've talked to has been arrested so far or anything like that. And I also openly defend them whenever I speak publicly about it, which is often. And sometimes I speak at trainings for security or, practitioners of some kind, organizations that want to help and stuff. And I always tell them, I underscore how not violent they are, how this is, an issue of threat to self-harm, maybe, if anything.
Mhm.
So yeah.
Anything else as far as like, well, we touched on technology and regulation, and that's a fine line to skirt there with that being a solution. Any other solutions you can think of that could help the incel community?
I think as a culture, we have a lot of problems. We've talked about a few of them, and I think that incels are a manifestation of broader, larger problems that you know aren't necessarily going to go away. I mean, the incels aren't necessarily going to go away just because of one size fits all sort of intervention.
Yeah.
Um, so you know,
Yeah, that's true. Because even if you offer mental health services, for example, and make them affordable, make them accessible, it still doesn't change. These women may not want to date you,
right?
that's the underlying
Yes,
issue.
exactly. And I do think that with most of them and with more of them than realize it, that something like mental health treatment would be helpful because there are these hangups and things, but not with all of them. And that that circumstance, that situation, that life situation, as they call it, is going to be there for some people. And, they're not necessarily going to be feeling fulfilled or happy with that. And I don't know that there's always something that can be done about that.
Mhm.
It's someone's individual circumstances. But
Mhm.
I think that just in general, less pressure on people to be this sort of very sexualized culture too. I think that's a big part of why so many people, because it's really not that abnormal to be a late bloomer. That's what we used to call some of these things.
Right. Or a nerd or.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that part of the reason this has become a thing is because now people feel that it is, and they're always comparing themselves.
Right. We're comparing ourselves to billions of people online, which is not normal or natural. But
Mm-mm.
here we are, it's 2022.
Yeah.
Um, so where do you see the future of the incel community? Do you think, so you mentioned that it's probably not going to go away, but do you think it will get better or do you think it'll get worse?
I think it will probably get maybe a little bit worse before it gets better. I don't think it will get worse in the sense that they will become violent or anything like that. I think that we might have attackers in the future that call themselves incels, or attackers that don't, but journalists and researchers that call them incels. There's obviously, we live in a pretty violent time. I mean, not more so than in the past, but in different kind of strange ways. But for the incels themselves, not talking about the violence or anything, I think it will eventually be something that is um, more or less accepted as, there are people that fit this description,
Mhm.
and they're not terrorists, and it won't be such a pejorative.
Mhm. And I think if you can get off of these forums, that is the main goal, is to get away from that as a crutch and to, force yourself to get out and socially interact,
Hmm.
force yourself to make friends. You don't even have to start with females. It sounds like some
Hmm.
of them struggle to make male friends
Yes.
in the real world.
Yes.
And so, you have to have some goals like that, I think,
Hmm.
also as part of the solution. And it's growing pains for some of them because they
Yeah.
didn't get that socialization in junior high or high
Yes.
school, and it's coming back in adulthood and showing
Hmm.
up.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And for some of them, they have very legitimate, conditions like being on the spectrum or something that make it harder to be social, but it's still something that most people need. I also think that little other kinds of life hacks, as we would call them, hobbies, passions, self-improvement, unrelated to the goal of getting
Video
a
games.
woman. Yeah, right, exactly. Would be helpful, and just kind of finding some meaning, because that's the main thing I think about these people, is they're looking for meaning and purpose in their lives.
Most definitely, most definitely. Well, we're getting to the end here. Do you have any final thoughts that you would like to share with the audience with regards to incels?
Um, I don't know if people are interested in them or interested in helping. I guess I would say that it's surprising how many of them are amenable to it or do want to talk uh, to people, to outsiders, to women, whatever. People want to talk and tell their story, and they're very different one-on-one than they are as a group. Completely different. So um, the way that they act on the forums and stuff is usually not the way that they act if they were to engage in some one-on-one conversation.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you, Naama. I really appreciate you coming on my channel and enlightening us with all of your investigative research that you've done with incels. I think you're doing a great job, and I appreciate you coming on today.
Thank you, Lisa. It's been great.
Yes. And if you guys like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to share and subscribe and hit the bell to be alerted to when the next video drops. Thanks for watching.